All right, we can go on then. I decided to make a few slides to kind of review yesterday, because yesterday was kind of like the proverbial fire hose. And you got kind of a whole big picture of being in time division one all at once. And that's a lot to handle. So I went back through to my own website and found some of the images that I made to explain Heidegger on my website. And I thought I would talk to you about some of them here, because I think they help break it down a bit. All right, this is a slide I made to kind of visualize ancient ontology. Does anyone recognize this character? Have you had 25A, ancient philosophy? Who says this kind of thing? Exactly. Yeah, Heraclitus. He's his one-liner that you may have heard in pop culture is something like, "You don't step into the same river twice." His idea is that reality is flux, change, constantly change. And so for him, the being of beings, the way that entities are, the mode of being of any particular entity is change. So this is an example of someone doing ontology. And so Heidegger is intervening in the history of ontology. There's a whole history of people trying to say, what's the ultimate nature of reality? That normally corresponds with some conception of human nature also. And as I told you last time, Heidegger's kind of looking at what he thinks of as the structure that makes any possible interpretation of reality possible. And so, only change is real is an example of an interpretation of the being of beings, of the meaning of being. Any particular entity has a mode of being. And for Heraclitus, that mode of being is change. I pointed out that Heidegger wants to change the focus of traditional ontology. And rather than kind of starting from where he saw traditional philosophers starting from, which is kind of sitting back and theorizing about the world, looking out at the world like an observer and asking, what is all this stuff? He proposes that we instead start with what he calls everyday familiarity. The skills that we have for dealing with different kinds of things without even thinking about it. So you have skills for sitting on benches, for driving cars, for hanging out with cats, for sitting under trees. And in your own activity, you distinguish among these different kinds of entities without thinking about it. So in your everyday know-how for getting around in the world is embedded a kind of ontological knowledge. You already are distinguishing different kinds of entities. You distinguish your cat from your car. You relate to them differently and from other people. Already within your everyday know-how are ontological distinctions that you can use with your skill without even knowing it, without paying attention to them. And Heidegger's project is to kind of help us excavate that ontological knowledge that we already have that's built into our everyday skills. So his trick is to say, we need to do this without acting like theorists. We need to find a way to describe, to dig into our everyday know-how, the kind of activity we can do without thinking about it. We need to find a way to think about that, to describe that. And that's a trick. How do you think about and describe the mode of activity that only really happens when you're not thinking about it? So it takes a different kind of description. This is what, for him, phenomenology consists in. Phenomenology is a kind of method, descriptive method, for paying attention to and describing your experiences that doesn't involve the old-fashioned way of doing philosophy of just sitting back and theorizing and saying, what is all this stuff? Did you know that our word for theory shares a common etymological root with the word for theater? A theater is a place where you sit back, you're detached from the action, and you're watching as an external spectator. And when we're acting as theorists about the world, we're standing back and observing. And we're like, if we're ontologists in the traditional sense, we're standing out and observing, and we're like, what is all this stuff? Heidegger thinks you're going to import with you all kinds of ontological prejudices without even realizing it when you start from that theoretical perspective. He says, we need to start over doing ontology. We need to do ontology as phenomenology. And phenomenology is a method of describing our everyday experiences, those kinds of experiences that we have without thinking about it. Making your breakfast, the way you can make your favorite breakfast and make a cup of coffee in a kind of daze without being aware of what's going on. If you're a musician, the way you can play a song after you've rehearsed it enough times, you can play it without thinking about it. The way you get to know the campus and you can cruise around talking to your friends or texting without even looking up because you have a certain know-how of getting around. The world is showing up to you in some way when you're in that involved familiarity. So this kind of showing up to you is what phenomenologists call the phenomena. Phenomena are what appear, and phenomenology is the study of appearances, the logos of appearances. So phenomenology is what appears, and Heidegger thinks the world appears in a special way that all of the traditional philosophers have passed over. The world appears in a special way when we're engaged in this everyday familiarity. This is just another image I was trying to make. I was asking the AI to make an image of me for different kinds of entities and the way we have an awareness or a know-how for dealing with different kinds of entities. Already in our know-how, we relate to trees differently than cats, than bicycles, than benches. And like I said, Heidegger wants to excavate that know-how for thinking about what kind of entities we are and what is the world. In his view, traditional philosophers are relating to the world in the stance of theoretical detachment. They're looking out at the world and they're like, what is all this stuff? And the way I think about that is that, have you ever been like in a vacation house or a friend's house and you go to the kitchen and you can't find anything? You open up every cupboard, you're like, where are the plates? There's the coffee. Where are the knives? There's the Tupperware lids. What is this machine? Is this an orange juice maker or a coffee maker? You don't recognize any of the stuff. You're kind of lost and looking around. You're in this, that puts you in this theoretical perspective when you have to, you're in this, what Heidegger calls a deficient mode of engaging with the world. And so then you're in this theoretical stance and the world is showing up to you as a bunch of objects that you have to investigate to understand what their properties are and what their definition is. So he thinks traditional philosophers and traditional ontologists relate to the world like it's an unfamiliar kitchen. Like they don't pay attention to that way of getting around in your own kitchen where you can just move and make your breakfast without thinking about it. And so I asked the AI to make me a guy that looks like Schopenhauer, because I've been reading Schopenhauer lately. Schopenhauer is a German philosopher from like the mid-19th century. He's so weird and interesting, and if you ever get a chance to read him, I recommend it. It's beautiful. And he does this weird mashup of Buddhism and Hinduism with German idealism, and he has a pessimistic view that he gets from Buddhism because he takes over this view that life is essentially suffering, and the best thing to do would not have been born at all. But since you're here, you can do different things to kind of overcome the cycle of suffering. He recommends looking at art. Ultimately, he recommends destroying your own ego, like a Buddhist. Anyway, he's beautiful. So this is a Schopenhauer in an unfamiliar kitchen with his cat. Okay, that's what I called the strange familiarity. Familiarity is strange to us because we're not used to paying attention to it. Heidegger wants us to pay attention to the familiarity that we normally don't pay attention to, because it's hard to pay attention to it because you're just doing it. So he thinks you need a method to notice our familiarity. And like I was saying, our familiarity, he thinks, kind of contains an understanding of being. But that familiarity covers itself up. We don't notice it because when you're going around doing stuff that you know how to do, that's what it is. You're not thinking about it. That's that weird mode of activity that we're capable of. And like I said, he thinks it contains understandings of being. We automatically, well, automatically is not the right way. We have a sensibility for distinguishing ready-to-hand equipment from other Daseins and from present-at-hand stuff. He thinks that's already contained in our everyday know-how. And being in time is going to try to let us pay attention to that know-how and then excavate it for these different ontological distinctions, like the ones we were talking about yesterday. All right. And this is just to shout out my teacher, Professor Dreyfus. The kind of interpretation I gave you right now is influenced by his view of Heidegger. When he's the one who started to point out when Heidegger has that weird quote about being, that what is being, that on the basis of which entities are already understood. And I just went through this whole speech that on the basis of which entities are already understood is our skillfulness for getting around in the world without thinking about it. And that skillfulness for getting around within the world without thinking about it contains an ontology. We make ontological distinctions in our everyday know-how. We relate to readiness to hand of equipment without thinking about it when we just use equipment. So the being of entities is available in our skills for using them. Or what Bert, his name was Hubert Dreyfus, his friends called him Bert, what Bert called the background practices. So I'm just giving Bert a shout out because I think he helped make sense of this very difficult stuff. So what did I say here? The focus on everyday skills and how they reveal and constitute our understanding of being. Creating the background on the basis of which we relate to entities is characteristic of Dreyfus's interpretation. Well, that's a convoluted sentence that tries to say what I just said.